What's going on, guys? So in this video, this is going to be a little bit different than the rest of my videos, but in this video I want to address a specific problem that is known, or I guess two specific problems that are known for the 2JZ engines when you're modifying them. And it's something that, if you saw the thumbnail, you kind of know the direction that I'm going with this, and I'm not at all trying to talk down about the Throtl YouTube channel. I love watching their videos. This is something that you would know if you're building 2JZ engines, if you're around a lot of guys that are racing 2JZ engines, you would find out about these two inherent weaknesses that are in the design. And it comes from modifying an engine and then pushing the stock parts past their limit. Something fails. So you can know everything there is to know about building engines and start building a 2JZ and do the exact same thing that they did and overlook the things that they've overlooked in their build progress. So I'm not at all saying that they don't understand, they don't know what they're talking about, whatever. Like, I have a ton of respect for them. But conveniently enough, and this is pretty cool that, you know, this happened like this, I am right in the middle of upgrading those parts on my engine that I have on the workbench. This is a 2JZ-GTE head. I'm right in the middle of upgrading that, so I can talk about, like, hey, these are the parts that they used in their engine, and this is why you don't want to use them, and these are the parts that I'm putting into mine, and this is why I'm putting these into my engine. And there's another thing that I want to get to and talk about after that that would exaggerate this problem, but it's also a known problem for the 2JZs if you're modifying them. In stock form, they last hundreds of thousands of miles without any issues on these parts most of the time. There's defects and whatever, but outside of that, they last for hundreds of thousands of miles. It's when you're modifying them. So the specific thing that I'm talking about and I want to address in this video is the use of shimless buckets versus the shim over bucket, which is the factory Toyota style. So this is a shim over bucket. So the stock cams, they don't cause this problem. The higher lift cams and the longer duration cams, the shim will slip out of the bucket. It irreparably damages the head. And this is fairly easy to find online. If you do some quick Google searching, you can find where that exact same thing has happened to people. They upgrade their cams and they upgrade their valve springs, and what happens is you have the cam lobe that's pushing on the valve spring. So here's my old springs, and this spring sits underneath that bucket that I was just showing. You have a thicker spring now, a heavier spring in the head that's pushing back against the cam lobe, and you have the cam lobe that's pushing down against, and that bucket is right in the middle of those two things. So it causes the shim to slip out, and when that happens, you have a destroyed head. In Throtl's case, they have a brand new head. They used the stock style buckets that have the shim sitting on top. Instead of the shimless buckets, they just used whatever came in the engine originally from the manufacturer, which is what makes it dangerous and is what makes it a ticking time bomb, because it's really only a matter of time before that shim slips out of the bucket because of the 276 duration cams and the high lift associated with those cams. It's basically just a ticking time bomb until they have to spend $5,000 or so on a new set of cams and another valve and valve spring, buckets, and an entire new head, which is roughly around $3,000, I think. All of that stuff plus the work associated with it, and then getting the buckets that they should have gotten in the first place. So that's why I'm making this video. Toyota has 3 different styles of shims that they use in this type of setup, and this is a shim over bucket. The 3rd Gen 3S-GTE that I had, that I've got build videos on from like 10 years ago. That's bad. I've already dropped this one, I don't care. Is that a blooper? That's a blooper. So don't frantically wave your arms around or the shim would pop out of the bucket. And I love how that happened because it's a perfect example of what could happen. I'm totally gonna keep that in the video. I'm not going to edit that out. The shim under bucket style is what was in the 3rd Gen 3S-GTE, and it's basically, there's a shim that sits on the very bottom part of the bucket where that little dot is. And it kind of sticks in there with a magnet, similarly to how this one sticks on top with a magnet. And I've marked this one with an X because I've already dropped it once before, so it's not going back into the engine. I don't care about these though. I was really only using them to measure the shim thicknesses so that I can order replacement shims. That's what it looks like after you pop it out, which I've already shown that because I was waving my arms around violently, and of course the shim's gonna fly out. And the better shim, these are Toyota's newer, lighter shimless buckets. And with this, it's a shim and it's a bucket in one. Instead of having 40 different part numbers for shims and one part number for the bucket, they just simplified it and made it 40 different part numbers for the shimless buckets. And if you look on the bottom, this one is numbered 42, and they have there's a ton of numbers that are associated with these. If you look at the bottom, then you would know that, okay, this is a 42. I want to make my valve lash a little tighter, so I'm going to put a 43 in it. And the measurements and what that breaks out to in millimeters is all online. So there's a couple options. There's the expensive, they're DLC shim buckets, and those are, it's a diamond-like coating, and it's an extremely hard surface that they put on the top of these style, they're aftermarket shim buckets, basically. So it's a diamond-like coating surface that they put on the top. But really, the factory, these I got out of a junkyard. Like, these are pretty clean, and they have, it shows a little bit of a wear on the bottom, but there's no groove. Like, you can run your finger across it and there's no groove. Where these that I got from a cheap engine, so I picked this engine up for like next to nothing, but if you look, like, you can feel the grooves. Like, obviously you can't because you're just watching via camera, but I can run my finger across this and you feel the difference. This is horrible. Somebody ran this low on oil, or ran it on bad oil for a long time, and that's what happens. That's why you change your oil, because that happens. But I was thinking those buckets would be in better shape than they are, because they really, I've never seen them look like that bad, especially in a Toyota. So these specific buckets, they came out of the Scion TC engines, the early 2000 second generation RAV4. It's a 1AZ and a 2AZ engine. These buckets are in it. They're also in the FJ Cruisers and the Tacomas, the 2005 to 2015 Tacomas. I don't know about the 4-cylinder, but these are 6-cylinder ones that I just showed. They're all the same. You can look up the part number for these, and I'll have a few examples down in the description, but you can buy these. They're like 16, 17 bucks a piece, or you could find a junkyard and like you could spend all day in a junkyard and come away with 150 buckets, just because of how many of these cars and these engines are in junkyards and how easy it is to come across them in the 2000 to 2015 Toyota engines. They're just in this same part number is in a ton of engines. So extremely worth it, fairly cheap if you want to spend the time, and fairly easy if you want to spend the money and upgrade to the DLC ones, or just get new valve buckets. That's like 17 bucks a piece for 24 of them. Do that math. I'm not going to do it. I'd rather get them from a junkyard and just inspect them and make sure that they're good, because it's cheaper. And in the end, it does the same thing. So that's one problem, and that's how you can bypass that one problem. Very expensive problem, very common problem when you upgrade to the cams that I've upgraded to, and the cams that Throtl is. So they're running 276 duration cams, where I have 274 duration cams that are the same brand. They have the same springs in theirs, the titanium retainer setup. That's the same stuff that's going into mine. That video I'll be posting next. It's going to be more of like a time-lapse build thing. The other problem that I was talking about comes down to this. So Toyota's factory timing tensioner. So I drew a line on it, this black line on it. That's actually me. I drew that with a marker because that's the common breaking point. Also, from doing the same upgrade to the head that I've done, you're increasing the pressure that your valve springs are putting on that cam lobe. Your cam lobe is directly connected to the camshaft, which is connected to the cam gear, which is connected to the timing belt. Timing belt goes around the timing tensioner. So your aggressive valve springs are basically putting more pressure on this. These end up snapping in half. I'll have some pictures popping up of some quick pictures from Googling that I found of guys that these have snapped in half. It's been like it's like since this engine has been around and people have been modifying it, this has been happening. Because of this, guys upgrade to, it's so nice and pretty. This is billet aluminum. So it's all solid aluminum, machined billet aluminum, where this is cast aluminum, and it does its job in the factory application. It's great, right? But whenever you start upgrading your engine, spend a couple $100 and get the billet aluminum timing tensioner that I have there, and it's so much thicker. Like the difference in thickness of it, I can't really get my camera pointed down there to show, but like if you look at the side of this where it's about 1/4 of an inch, this one is about that thick. So it's like roughly like 3/8 of an inch. Like it's like the thickness of this. And it's billet instead of cast. And billet is just stronger than the cast. So, and I mentioned this as a potential problem with their build also because they didn't change it out. They didn't use an OEM one. They actually used some off-brand auto parts store brand, which I definitely wouldn't do. I always use strictly OEM stuff whenever I'm doing something like this because of the quality and the longevity that it brings. In this case, it's probably going to lessen the lifespan of this part even more because it's not made to the same quality and craftsmanship as the Toyota OEM parts. So this would end up breaking probably sooner than the other part. And if you think about it, the shock wave that this would send down, like whenever this thing snaps, this is directly connected to those, well, indirectly connected to those valve buckets. So if those two things aren't upgraded and this snaps, that would, I would guess that it would accelerate the damaging of the head because it would cause one of those shims to slip out of the bucket, float around in the head and do all the damage that it's gonna do, which is not good. So, Throtl, if you're watching, I love your videos, they're awesome, but upgrade this and reshim your head with the those valve buckets that I have, because that is going to be a lifesaver for the engine, and it's going to be the difference between that engine lasting 10+ years versus however long it's going to last until those shims come out, or until this breaks and possibly causes the shims to slip out, and then you have to spend $5,000 in replacement parts to get a new head, cam, valve springs, buckets, all that stuff. It would be kind of pricey. It would be a very pricey problem to have happen. Another little thing, I mean, this is tiny. I wouldn't say this is like detrimental, but the usage of the non-OEM oil pump versus the OEM oil pump. OEM oil pumps, OEM parts in general from Toyota they're second to none. Like, they are the best. Until you move into performance applications and you're working on that stuff. The OEM oil pump, I wouldn't have run anything less on that build just because of the level of abuse that it can handle as an OEM part. There are upgraded oil pumps that flow higher volumes of oil. Those cost money, that's fine. But the OEM oil pump costs a little bit more than the off-brand oil pumps, and they're just far better quality. I wouldn't have gone with anything less, because if it's a water pump, whatever, who cares? If it starts to fail, then you have issues associated with that. Your temperature starts to climb, and then you have time to salvage the engine. If your oil pump starts to fail, that is just a domino effect of other problems that cause catastrophic engine failure. Not as much of a risk as it is not running the shimless buckets in the head, but still a risk nonetheless. So again, I want to reiterate, the overall tone of this video is not intended to be, those Throtl guys don't know what they're talking about. It's real. I'm just really trying to highlight something that you would know if you've worked around 2JZ engines, if you've investigated thoroughly into 2JZ engine building, or whatever the case, that you would find out that yes, you want to run shimless buckets, and yes, you want to upgrade to a billet timing tensioner. You're putting a lot of stress on those parts, and they work well in a factory application, but they're not designed to do what's being asked of them in a drag race application or whatever the case. So I hope this video was helpful, informative, and anybody else that's out there that's thinking about moving into the 2JZ platform and you're very familiar with engine building, replace those two things, because without replacing those two things, you are going to have problems. If you've upgraded to the parts that I've upgraded, that I've shown in this video, and that's the heavy duty valve springs, cams, they accelerate other failures of other parts. Thanks a lot for watching, and as always, God bless you guys.